tension flared again on 24 November 2025, when hundreds of internally displaced people, who have lived for years in relief camps around Imphal, moved out of camp compounds in Eku, Dole Tharbi and Yenkuman, and tried to press toward Kuki-dominated districts outside the buffer zones. Security personnel stopped them near Pukhao and the Dole Tharbi Dam and fired tear gas to disperse the crowds. The immediate scene, people who have been living under tarpaulins demanding the right to recover their livelihoods while a state festival plays out in the capital, is a stark, painful image of a fracture between public pageantry and private dispossession. That clash, captured in contemporaneous reporting, is not a fresh anomaly, but the live expression of a long, slow unraveling in which territory, memory and political power are locked together. To read this moment aright, you cannot separate the human desperation from the cartography of fear. The displaced who moved on 24 November said the Sangay Festival's message of normalcy, parades, visitors, curated culture, made them feel the state was turning a page they had not been allowed to write for themselves. Many are farmers cut off from their fields, parents watching children grow up without schools, and households for whom the meager state allowance does not replace the lost economy of a homestead. Their attempt to move, therefore, is not merely symbolic. It is a material attempt to reclaim means of survival and a dignity that years of displacement have eroded. At the same time, the places they move toward, Kuki-dominated districts lying beyond established buffer lines, are understood by Kuki leaders as sensitive, even sacrosanct, spaces that must remain protected until durable political guarantees are in place. That clash of incentives, return versus protection, is the kernel of why a march becomes a flashpoint. Those buffer zones, imposed in the aftermath of the May 2023 violence, were meant as temporary bulwarks, tactical separations to stop the immediate bloodshed and to allow time for negotiation and rehabilitation. Over time, they have hardened into quasi-political boundaries that regulate who can move where and under what conditions. For many Kuki organizations, the zones are not temporary inconveniences but necessary shields. They argue that until a negotiated constitutional settlement guarantees Kuki autonomy, policing, land rights and cultural protections, opening those lines will expose their communities to renewed vulnerability. For many displaced Métis, however, the same lines feel like cages. They are barred from tilling fields, accessing markets and resettling family homes. Each crossing attempt becomes, therefore, more than a movement of people. It is a political signal and a test of wills. The Kuki demand for what they term separate administration must be read through that prism of fear as well as history. This demand has been reiterated repeatedly by Kuki umbrella bodies and SOO suspension of operations groups. It is framed not as a disavowal of the Indian Union, but as a constitutional remedy, a secure administrative structure, variously discussed as a union territory with a legislature or a special autonomous arrangement that would allow the Kuki majority hill districts to govern key domains like local policing, land allocation, education, and cultural institutions. Their argument is both instrumental and existential. Instrumentally, they claim that local control will let them govern resources and security in ways that national or state arrangements have historically failed to do. Existentially, they assert that separate administration is a protection against a demographic and political squeeze they feel from a more powerful valley majority. This demand is rooted in long memories of marginalization, episodes of violence where Kuki civilians suffered grievously, and a fear that without institutional safeguards, their language, customs and social systems will be diluted or threatened. From the perspective of public order enforced by the central administration, the present calm is fragile and engineered. Since the imposition of direct central rule in recent years, large-scale visible massacres have not recurred with the frequency of 2023, but that relative quiet is maintained chiefly by containment, heavy patrols, checkpoints, and the buffer architecture. Critics therefore warn that President's rule is a holding pattern. It can prevent immediate explosions, but it cannot substitute for a negotiated political settlement that reconciles competing claims to land, administration and identity. The 24 November dispersal is a reminder that when people's material needs and claims to rights are not addressed, containment will repeatedly be punctured by the pressure of those needs, and the state's response is likely to be repressive rather than remedial. It helps to trace the logic of separation as it has emerged. Political marginalization, A slow exclusion from decision-making, resources, and meaningful local agency is the catalyst. Cultural difference and trauma are the accelerants. Kuki leaders point to patterns of neglect, infrastructure deficits in hill districts, weak representation in policymaking, and a series of flashpoint incidents that confirmed for many people that the state's ordinary institutions could not be counted on to protect them. Gendered violence during the worst waves of the conflict has been invoked repeatedly by Kuki women's organizations as a grievous signal that their communities cannot be left defenseless. These testimonies make the demand for self-administration not simply political but moral. If separation is framed by Kuki bodies as a shield against cultural extinction and demographic marginalization, it is because the perceived costs of remaining under an unchanged Manipur governance structure are thought, by many Kukis, to be existential. Opponents of a separate administration warn, with some validity, that formalizing ethnic separation risks hardening identities and entrenching partition. They point out that converting buffer zones into political borders could institutionalize segregation and make reconciliation harder. It could also create minority anxieties inside any new administration created. Smaller tribes or non-Kuki communities in the hills could feel excluded, and set a precedent that territorial re-engineering is the method for resolving identity conflicts. Those are real dangers. What the Kuki argument rejects, however, is a history in which constitutional promises of protection and equal treatment have repeatedly failed to produce lived security. For them, separation is not triumphalism. It is a defensive strategy to build institutions that can protect language, land, and life. The political debate, then, is not only about lines on maps, but about which institutional architecture best secures human dignity for vulnerable communities. The humanitarian dimension cannot be overstated. Circumstances on the ground make any simplistic winner lose a calculus cruel. IDPs have returned government aid in protest because the daily ration is insufficient. Suicides and mental health crises have been recorded in relief camps, and generations of children are being denied normal schooling and social anchors. The sight of camps emptied briefly into the streets and gassed back is a moral indictment of a settlement that prioritizes spectacle over repair. Any sustainable political arrangement must therefore be tethered to a human reality. Returns that are not safe and economically viable are not returns at all. That is why Kuki insistence that buffer zones remain until guarantees are given matters. It is a demand to prevent returns becoming triggers for fresh violence, but it must be balanced by mechanisms that allow displaced people to rebuild without the fear of being weaponized as a demographic pressure. So what concretely would a responsible path forward look like, given that the central political problem is a deficit of trust and institutional protection? The central requirement is to treat buffer zones as binding transitional safeguards rather than open or arbitrary barriers. That means legally formalizing their status and operational rules, specifying their exact boundaries, the modalities of movement across them, and the neutral monitoring mechanisms that enforce compliance. Buffer zones must be safeguarded not as an end in themselves, but as the protective infrastructure that buys time for negotiation. They are the scaffolding, imperfect, but essential, that prevents a slide back into mass violence while parties bargain over long-term arrangements. In short, the zones should be frozen as security guarantees until a comprehensive agreement is struck. Negotiation must then proceed on several linked tracks. First, a political dialogue framework needs to be instituted under central auspices with credible mediators and real representation. Kuki councils, hill civil society groups, including women and youth, Métis Valley representatives, neutral civil society, and constitutional experts. That dialogue must have clear terms of reference and deadlines, not artificial timelines, but milestones that link security measures to political deliverables. Second, any agreement on separate administration must be constitutional and concrete. If the outcome is a union territory or a special autonomous arrangement, it must clearly assign control over policing, land, education and cultural institutions to local bodies, while embedding robust protections for minorities within that territory. Third, humanitarian and return protocols must be real and enforceable. Returns must be voluntary, phased, accompanied by security guarantees, property restitution mechanisms or compensation, livelihood support and third-party monitoring. Without those material assurances, nominal return will be a recipe for new confrontation. Parallel to formal negotiations, confidence-building measures are essential. Shared economic projects that create interdependence, joint markets, cooperative irrigation schemes, cross-boundary schools, can change incentives so that violence becomes more costly than cooperation. Joint security mechanisms, such as mixed local patrols or community policing units, can reduce the perception that buffer zones favor one side. Cultural exchange and truth-telling initiatives, carefully designed and safe, can begin the slow work of repairing civic trust. None of this is quick. Reconciliation is granular and mundane, not glamorous, but the alternative remains cycles of mobilization, displacement, and repression. There are, of course, real risks. Spoilers can always append a negotiated settlement. Hardline actors on either side might reject compromise, militant outfits could exploit any vacuum, and national political calculations may delay or dilute the commitments needed. Implementation will be the hardest phase. Converting written guarantees into experienced security requires robust monitoring and credible enforcement. For this reason, any settlement should create an independent joint commission, composed of central government officials, representatives chosen by both communities, and neutral observers, with a mandate to monitor buffer zone integrity, oversee phased returns, and adjudicate disputes quickly and transparently. Reviews at fixed intervals should be embedded in the agreement so that the process can be adaptive rather than static. Above all, the politics must acknowledge that separate administration for the Kukis is not a frivolous demand to be brushed aside. It is a response to structural exclusion, recurrent violence, and cultural vulnerability. If policymakers treat it as a bargaining chip rather than a legitimate claim rooted in survival, they will deepen the distrust that the buffer zones currently encapsulate. Conversely, if the demand is accepted carefully, with constitutional clarity, built-in protections for internal minorities, and economic linkages to the rest of the state, it may offer a way to convert a pause enforced by security into a durable settlement grounded in legitimacy. That is the narrow political seam that, if stitched well, can make the protective promise of buffer zones permanent in effect but temporary in form. Protections while institutions are built, doors opened when guarantees are operative. The scene on 24 November should therefore be read as both warning and opportunity. It warns that humanitarian desperation will continue to puncture any brittle calm. It offers an opportunity to insist on an integrated strategy that holds buffer zones in place while negotiating political architecture and building livelihoods. Pragmatically, this means the central government must invest political capital now to formalize buffer zones under transparent rules, to set up the mediated dialogue with tight participation and clear goals, to legislate agreed institutional changes, and to fund the humanitarian and economic packages that make returns viable. If this does not happen, what the state now calls normalcy will remain shallow, a festival for visitors while entire communities sleep in limbo and anger accumulates. For those watching from afar, the lesson of Manipur is stark. Security containment without political settlement stores up future violence. For those living inside the zones, the lesson is more immediate and visceral. Borders that look like protection for some look like exile for others. The only practical path out of that dilemma is to make the buffer lines the scaffolding, not the solution, to safeguard them until a negotiated, constitutional settlement delivers meaningful self-governance for the Kuki community while guaranteeing rights and security for all residents. Until that compact is written, funded, and implemented, each attempt by displaced people to move and each tightening or loosening of a patrol line will remain a potential spark. The 24 November incident is therefore less an isolated disturbance than a status report. The pause continues, but the bill for postponement is now due. Sources: India Today. Frustrated displaced people clash with security forces in Manipur, 24 Nov 2025. New Indian Express/PTI. Internally displaced people clash with security forces as they attempt to return to native homes, 24 Nov 2025. India Today. NE Kuki groups demand maintaining buffer zones in Manipur. Separate Union Territory call, 31 May 2025. Deccan Herald. Demand for separate administration remains, says Kuki Group, Feb 2025. Times of India. Forces stop IDPs from returning home over security concerns, July 2025. Context on return attempts and buffer zone policing. Full disclaimer, Zalengam Media. This analysis is a synthesis of publicly available reporting and commentary intended to explain recent events, historical context, and political dynamics in Manipur. While every effort has been made to represent multiple perspectives and to cite reliable reporting, the situation is fluid and contested. Local realities include voices, facts, and nuances that may not be fully captured here. This piece does not endorse any political position. Use of any video, images, or eyewitness material should be guided by legal and ethical norms, protecting the dignity and safety of affected people. Thank you for watching. Please do share this video. Also, don't forget to subscribe Zalengam Media.